From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Library of Congress. My name is Bob Patrick, and I'm the director of the Veterans History Project, a special collection of the library's American Folklife Center. The Veterans History Project is a congressionally mandated effort to collect and preserve the wartime memories of America's veterans. We're in our 12th year of doing just that, this very important effort. And it's thanks to the efforts of volunteer organizations, institutions, and even individuals, we have been able to amass an archive of some 80,000 collections of veterans, veterans from World War I all the way up to veterans from the most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is a permanently preserved archive here at the Library of Congress that we hope in the future will inspire, will instruct, and will educate. It is educating and inspiring people today, and we know because it's here at the Library of Congress, it's going to be preserved for generations to come. Today, we are doing our part to commemorate Women's History Month. We are honored to present a panel of women veterans from the first Persian Gulf War. Desert Shield and Desert Storm marked a turning point in the role of women in war, as many women were called upon to serve in mainstream mission roles for the first time. Just over 20 years ago, women from all military services set a standard that we have seen upheld to the highest level in our most recent conflicts over the last 10 years in Iraq and Afghanistan. We at the Veterans History Project trust that today's discussion will raise further awareness of the contribution of women who served in the Persian Gulf War and will also inspire other women to come forward and tell their story. I've been talking to several folks that are here in the audience today about who the veteran in their life is. And I would ask you during the course of this discussion to think about who the veteran in your life is, be it a woman or a man, a father, a grandfather, an aunt. Think about that and what their contribution has been to the military, and maybe take a part in the Veterans History Project by capturing their story. Before I introduce our moderator today, I would like to call Juanita to the podium, who has a few words about the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Good afternoon. I just want to let you know that I do work at the Department of Veteran Affairs here in Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, I work for two centers. I work for the Center for Minority Veterans, 75%, and also for the Center for Women Veterans, 25%. Both offices are in the Office of the Secretary, and I kind of split my time in between with the Center for Minority Veterans. I'm the American Indian Veterans Liaison. I work with tribal leaders nationwide and their veterans, and also any veteran that comes for assistance, we help them. We just help them across the board. Also with the Center for Minority Veterans, both centers were established by Congress in 1994 by Public Law 103-446. And within the Center for Women Veterans, the director serves as a primary advisor to the Secretary on department policies, programs, and legislation that affect women veterans. So when I'm working with the Center for Women Veterans, I focus on all minority female vets, and any issues or concerns are brought up to that office. I also brought up brochures, quick series to hand out. They're in the back, and also I brought up information sheets on both centers. And so if you would like to have a copy, they're in the back. Thank you.
Thanks, Juanita. The Department of Veterans Affairs has been a great supporter of this project throughout, and we're great to have you here. It's great to have you here today. It is now my privilege to introduce the moderator for today's panel. Captain Lori Manning, U.S. Navy retired, served in the United States Navy for over 25 years and is now the director of the Women in the Military Project at the Women's Research and Education Institute here in Washington, D.C. During the Persian Gulf War, Captain Manning served on the staff of the Commander in Naval Forces Europe, and in this assignment, she was part of a team that coordinated telecommunications requirements and support for U.S. and allied forces participating in the war. Captain Manning's field tours include Communications Officer, Naval Computer and Telecommunications Station, NCTS, Iceland, Executive Officer, NCTS, Balboa, Panama, and Commanding Officer, NCTS, Diego Garcia. She has also served on the staff of the Chief of Naval Operations, the Chief of Navy Personnel, the Chief of Legislative Affairs, and on the London staff of the Commander, U.S. Navy Forces Europe. And as a former Army officer, you had some pretty nice assignments there, Captain Manning.
I did.
Captain Manning served on the Secretary of Veterans Affairs Advisory Committee on Women Veterans from 1998 to 2004, and on the Military Advisory Committee of the Service Members Legal Defense Network from 2006 to 2009. She is a recognized expert on veterans issues, particularly as they apply to women. She has been a frequent guest commentator on a plethora of television and radio networks that are too numerous to mention. It's the whole alphabet that we all know about TV and radio. It is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to Captain Lori Manning, who will introduce our panel members and lead our discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Lori Manning.
Thank you. It's great to be here on this beautiful and moderately cool, which I prefer to the 80 degrees weather outside. It's just gorgeous around this building today. Before I introduce the first of the speakers, I want to give you a little bit of a summary about where women in the military stood at about the time the Persian Gulf War started. The Persian Gulf War, for those of you who are old enough to remember it, and since it was 20 years ago, it's probably not all of you who remember it very well. It was the first major test of the all-volunteer force against a large, well-armed, well-ordered enemy. And the verdict, frankly, was still out on how effective such a force would be. And the biggest doubt was the part of that force who were women. Before the end of the all-volunteer force in 1972, less than 2% of the people in the military were women. Now they were sitting at about 11%, and they were beginning to creep into many more occupations than they had been in 1972, and they were getting more senior, both in the enlisted ranks and in the officer ranks, than they had been when the draft expired. Many commentators on military matters thought the women simply would not be able to handle the stresses of deployment, and they would fail in the field to the detriment of the mission, of the men they were serving with, and frankly of themselves. Also, many people in the public, and if you were paying attention back 20 years ago, they would often do this trick on the nightly news shows. You'd see a soldier in full battle gear getting ready to deploy, and the camera would come in closer and closer and closer until you thought, oh my God, that's a woman. And when they really wanted to have fun, she'd be holding an infant or a toddler. The Persian Gulf War was the first time that we deployed large numbers of women who were not in the nurse corps to an active war zone. The women had deployed, certainly non-nurses in World War II and in World War I even, but they were well behind the lines. Only the nurses were up front in those days. And one of the reasons the nurses were that close was because there were no men in most of the nurse corps until sometime during the Vietnam War. So throughout Korea, World War II, World War I, there was an absence of men in one particular part of the military. And there was much consternation, particularly about the deployment of mothers. We had never, ever, before this time, deployed a mother to a war zone. And the U.S. was not the only country doing this. There were British women soldiers and sailors, Australians, Canadians. There were women from other countries there, but in the U.S., it was the biggest deployment. There were over 40,000 women who we deployed. The other thing that had changed after the end of Vietnam was that because of technological developments, Scud missiles and long-range field artillery, the front lines weren't so distinct anymore. It was a little less clear as to where you were safe and where you weren't. And as those of you who follow the Persian Gulf War know, that there were 6 women killed sleeping in an Air Force dormitory one night when it was hit by a Scud missile. So women in the Persian Gulf War were deploying. They were deploying in big numbers. Many of them were mothers, and they were, at that time, banned from being in air combat, sea combat, and by law and by practice from ground combat. But they were in great danger, even the ones who were serving behind the lines and the ones in the Air Force or the Navy who were aboard so-called non-combatant vessels. As you all know, because of where women are these days, they did very, very well. The doubts that many people had raised about their performance proved not to be the case. And there were some rewards for them after the Persian Gulf War, which I will mention at the end. Our first speaker today is going to be Julianna Mock. She served in the Persian Gulf War with the U.S. Army, 87th Medical Detachment Dental Service, and the 12th EVAC Hospital. Her unit provided dental support for Iraqi EPWs, prisoners of war, Iraqi POWs, or at the 301st Military Police Camp. During the months of January, February, and March 1991, the unit repeatedly experienced loud alarms of chemical detectors and ingested expired pyrostigmine bromide tablets. Since the war, she and her husband, also a Persian Gulf War veteran, experienced health complications. And in 2003, she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. She is now President, Veterans of Modern Warfare, and an advocate for Gulf War veterans' health. And there are still major health concerns with Gulf War veterans that we're still trying to sort out. So, Julianne, you can stay right there if you'd like, or come to the podium, whichever you prefer.
I'll stay here. So I was deployed from Germany with a 60-person dental team, and when we arrived in Saudi Arabia, we split up into 3 different 12 to 14-person teams. I was a hygienist assigned to our team. The 12th EVAC hospital was the most forward evacuation hospital established. We not only saw Americans, but we did, as Lori said, see the Iraqi EPWs down the road. When the war began, we of course had no idea what was going on. We didn't have the communications availability that the soldiers do now. We had no idea what was going on, and in fact, the only way we were able to get information was by listening to the BBC on a transistor radio. So we had some very unique experiences. We were never knowing exactly when we would be possibly under attack, what was going on. We were close enough to the border that we could feel the bombs as the air war began, but not knowing what would happen. We had 1 chemical suit assigned to each of us, and we went into MOP 4 gear, and there we sat for about a day. What a lot of people don't know is that once you break open a charcoal chemical suit, it's expired, and that was all we had. And as time went on, we now realize that we were exposed to the Camisea chemical plume cloud. And of course, we were inundated with a lot of oil well fire smoke. We were deployed for 5 months. We left back for Germany in May of '91. So that's my story.
And our next speaker is Juanita Mullen. She was raised on an Indian reservation and is a pioneer for American Indian women in the U.S. Air Force. She served stateside tours during the Gulf War in support of troops overseas, watching her husband deploy and caring for her children and family while serving. She herself was mobilized for deployment but was called back. She retired from the Air Force after 20 years, and after a stint at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, joined the VA Center for Minority Veterans and Center for Women Veterans. And she serves as the American Indian Veterans Liaison for both centers.
Good afternoon. I'm a member, as you all know, American Indian. My tribe is Seneca Nation of Indians up in New York State. I joined the military in 1980, and when I first joined, a lot of people say, it might be a long time for a lot of people, but when I joined the service, they did not have female uniforms. I had to wear male uniforms. And they would always laugh at me because when I go through an inspection line, my top pockets would actually be tucked in my pants. And they say, how does that happen? I go, well, the shirt was too long, and they just had to try to get around that, make sure my gig line, but my pockets tucked in. When I was stationed in Florida during the Gulf War, of course, during the time when I was in the military, I was known as Sergeant Campbell, Juanita Campbell. My first husband was also active duty. He was stationed at Duke Field, and as you know, I don't know if you're aware, but Eglin Air Force Base is a big mobility base, and he was stationed at Duke Field, and also it's a big mobility area. And when the Gulf War started, everybody that works on Eglin, we all have to be ready for mobility. We're all part of the mobility. We have to make sure our bags are packed, have our checklist checked, and of course we had 2 girls at the time and also a dog, and we had to prepare for them. And when the Gulf War, as soon as it kicked off, of course, and I worked night shifts, I had to work 12-hour shifts for like 2.5 months to 3 months, and I had 2 kids, 2 girls. And then when they started first deploying, I was one of the people that actually put my husband on a plane to get deployed with hundreds of others. And at the same time, I was on a tasking. Certain bases had to send so many people out from their respective bases. I was on a second task, and at that time I was supposed to represent Hill Air Force Base, and so they could meet their quota. And of course, the first tasking went through the line, and then I was just getting so close to go through the line to get the shots, in the backside. And it was quite a bit of fluids that they put back there, and I was kind of nervous about that. I can handle anything else but that shot in the backside. But during the whole time, when they canceled our first task, and it also canceled my task, and so I was grateful at the same time that I didn't have to get deployed, because I was worried about my girls, even though we had preparations made for them to go to Texas with their grandparents and that. And then I just kind of worried if anything happened. My first husband, when he was over in Iraq, he was stationed by the Patriots, and of course he would keep me in contact with what was going on over there, and then he would send me little souvenirs. He sent me a little souvenir of a Scud missile with the wires all hanging out of it, and I still have it, as souvenirs. But when I was, even though I was working 12-hour shifts, shipping everybody out, and go home and sleep, at the same time take care of the girls. And there was a lot of times they did get left alone at nighttime. I think my oldest was probably about 11, 12 years old, and they had to stay by themselves in the evening. And then I'd get home early in the morning after my shift was over, and then get them off to school. And this was going on for 2 to 3 months. And then when they started coming, my first husband stayed there during the whole time, till like March, when they started shipping everybody back. And when they were shipping people back, it's, of course, they would call me, and we did this, when they say, hey, your husband's, did the news, he's getting ready to put him on TV, and they call us, they look to make sure we catch him on there. And when troops started coming back, I know that even on our base, they would always forget about the dual military. They would always forget about the other military spouse, say, hey, we're there for you. And, they would usually do like the dependent wives, they would focus on them, and then they kind of forget about us and say, hey, what about us? We're working 12-hour shifts. Our spouses are over there, and we deal with the same pressures and the worries. But they kept me pretty busy, and, and then even though we were loading aircraft and get to talk with the civilian pilots, and they show us how to load, how their cargoes, and the little Coke cans, we sit and talk, drink Coke and that. But it was a good experience, and I learned quite a bit, and I would never trade it up. And thank you.
Our next speaker is Darlene Iskra. She was one of the first Navy officers who was a diver. And she was also the very first woman in the Navy to command a ship. It was the USS Opportune ARS-41, one of the non-combatants. And take off my glasses to read. She took command of the ship and took it to board during Desert Storm in January of 1991. In addition to her experience as a seagoing officer, her staff work included both enlisted personnel management at the Bureau of Naval Personnel, which I hear they're finally going to knock down it's the Navy Annex over in Virginia.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I talked to the base commander there, and they're actually letting a contract to knock it down sooner or later. He didn't say when. And she also worked in civil affairs, disaster, and did military attaché work for the Commander-in-Chief Pacific in the Republic of the Marianas in Guam and the Marianas Islands. She retired from the U.S. Navy as a commander in April 2000 and subsequently got her PhD in military sociology at the University of Maryland. And her story is included in the Veterans History Project collections and is featured in the Veterans History Project Voices of War.
Hi, thank you everybody for coming. My story begins a little bit before the war. I knew I was going to take command of Opportune. I was scheduled to take command of Opportune in January of 1991, but I wound up going there a little bit early because the previous commanding officer had to get medically evacuated from the area. He turned out he had stomach cancer. So, and I was also originally supposed to take the ship in Naples, Italy, which I subsequently did. So I got called from my home in Virginia, Norfolk, to get on a plane the day after Christmas and fly to Naples and take command of the ship. So I never really had a formal, big hoo-la-la turnover. I just walked on board the ship the day I arrived and set over the ship's command system. This is Lieutenant Commander Darlene Iskra, and I am now in command of this ship, and that was like it. So that was December 27th of 1990. And we were in Naples until the beginning of January, and we had, of course, had heard about all the buildup from Desert Shield. My ex-husband, I was married at the time, was involved with the buildup, but he had come home by the time I left for the deployment. And as Lori said, I was the first woman to command a Navy ship, even though it was a non-combatant ship. So there was a lot of publicity about that. And so the second day I was on the ship, the PAO, the Public Affairs Officer, contacted me and asked me if I'd be willing to do an interview with the local and international press. And I, of course, said yes. Primarily because I thought at the time, and I still do, that it was a really good news story for the Navy, especially during wartime with all this stuff that was going on. Now we have a woman in command of a ship that was forward deployed, and so I just thought it was the right thing to do. Anyway, so what happened was during Desert Storm, once the war started, my picture was, of course, in all the papers. And and a friend of my husband sent a copy of a paper that was in Saudi Arabia, an Arabic paper, sent it to my husband, and he's like thinking, oh, great. My wife is, out there, and now she could be a target, because of the publicity. But anyway, as it turned out, we did get underway for the Gulf, January 21st. We got underway, and our mission was to steam about 50 miles outside of Port Said, Egypt, and the Suez Canal in case the canal was mined and or a ship was sunk in the canal, which would prevent the canal from operating. So we steamed in this little 50-mile square area. We did go into Port Said one day for refueling and re-provisioning. We were actually anchored out. We could not go pier side for security reasons. But when the husbanding agent came on board via small boat, suddenly there were all these small boats that were crowding around the fantail of the ship, and I'm like thinking, oh my God, because like remember what happened with the USS Colt 20 years later. But when I talked to the husbanding agent, he assured me that they were just merchants that really wanted to sell, souvenirs to my crew. And so I reluctantly said, okay. So we had about a 2-hour market day on the fantail of the ship in Port Said, Egypt. And luckily there were no problems. Another thing that happened was, as one of the other women indicated, the chemical and biological threat. The Navy also provides MOP gear, the chemical, biological, nuclear threat gear to the ships. And of course, because we knew about the Scud missiles, but we didn't really know about the Scud missiles in terms of what their capabilities were. And we didn't know whether they could be fired from Iraq to Eastern Mediterranean. We didn't know if they could be fired on a moving target. We didn't know anything. And as, your name's Jessica, right? Julie, I'm sorry. As she said, we didn't have any communications either. Occasionally I would get messages over the radio and telling me what had happened, but it wasn't like in America where you're getting the news, minute by minute. We knew nothing like till 2 weeks after the fact of things most of the time. So I was really in a state of, I felt like a mushroom, I didn't really know a whole lot was going on. And I didn't have enough of these masks, these chemical masks and MOP gear for the whole entire crew. I had a crew of about 100 people. I only had like 90. So I had 10 people that had to go into what they call deep shelter anytime we went to general quarters. And we did wind up going to general quarters several times a day, because what wound up happening was, because again, we were a small non-combatant ship. We didn't have the big surface search radars. We had, air search radars. We had a small surface search radars. We didn't have any capability of communicating with aircraft. We could communicate, ship to ship and ship to shore, but that was about it. But every day and at different times of the day, a aircraft would come over us, and it was a friendly, but we didn't know it. You couldn't take chances that it was this friendly going to be all the time. So every day, whatever time they decide to fly over, we could see this aircraft coming low on the horizon, and then pop up, and and then go over. And they were doing it on purpose, I think, to see what our response would be. Of course, we went to GQ every time because, again, we didn't know whether it was a friendly or a foe. However, if it had been a foe, we wouldn't have been able to do anything anyway, because we didn't have any armament to shoot down an aircraft. We had some 50 caliber machine guns that could possibly shoot small boats if they happened to come near us. And we had 20 millimeter supposedly anti-aircraft guns, but they were, again, World War II vintage. My ship was built in 1944. And so it was all manually operated and, eyeballs. So there was no way we would have been able to shoot down a plane. For fun, so to speak, we used to do training with these 20 millimeter guns. And one of the things that we would try and shoot at, and again, no birds were killed in this operation. But if there was a bird flying over us, I'd say, okay, let's see if you can, try and shoot that bird, because you have to, forward and, all those things you have to try and do. Of course, the birds totally got away. They probably scared the hell out of them, but none of them were killed. But I thought it was a good practice. And the only other really exciting thing that happened during the war was I got a call. The only way we had a physical training on the ship was we had a couple of life cycle bicycling type of gear back in the salvage hold, and I'd always be down there in the afternoons riding my bike, and I'd have a sound-powered phone next to the bicycle, so they'd call me up, captain to the bridge, or they'd call over the PA system, captain to the bridge. I ran up there this one day. I was in my PT gear, which include it's a t-shirt and shorts. And this helicopter. There was 3 ships that had come over the horizon, and we identified them as Soviet vessels. And you recall that back in 1991, we were suddenly friendly with the Soviets. They were no longer our enemy because the Cold War had expired 2 years before. So they were our allies, and we were kind of watching them, three of them, and they deployed a helicopter to check us out. So this helicopter is hovering over the right side of the ship in the forward part of the bow. And so I'm standing up there looking, I have my binoculars, and I'm looking, I can see the guys, and he has his binoculars, and he's looking at me, and I wave. So suddenly the officer of the deck, the person who's actually driving the ship, it says, "Captain, they want to talk to you." So I said, okay. So I get on the ship-to-ship radio, and I said, "This is Lieutenant Commander Darlene Iskra, commanding officer of USS Opportune. Who are you?" And they're like, "Commanding officer? Yes." Okay, well, we're just on our way to the Suez Canal, and we just thought we would, just make sure that everything was fine. Yes, everything's fine. But it was really hilarious because you could tell they were really surprised about having a woman's voice over the intercom there. And I was the only woman on board, so that would have been that. So then when I went back out on the fantail and I'm waving again, they're just kind of looking at me, and then they went off. Happy journeys. So we eventually, of course, the war eventually stopped as far as the fighting was concerned, and we got back to Little Creek in April of 1991 to a hero's welcome, so that was pretty fun too. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thanks. Our fourth speaker, Gail Shillingford, is not here. If she comes in while we're all still here, we will be eager to hear what she has to say. But since she's not, I want to sum up a couple of the themes and then ask some questions of the panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions from you. Some of the key themes of the women's service in the Gulf War have already come up. The deployment of one or both members of a joint military family. By that I mean where both parents, both partners are in the military, particularly when there are children that have to be taken care of. The exposures that men and women veterans experienced and the aftermath of those, as Julianna has mentioned. The surprise of women in commanding officer billets and jobs. And also, although maybe a lot of you missed it, there was one whale of a lot of publicity about women this, women that, and sometimes it rubbed the guys that we were serving with the wrong way. You know, hey, I'm deploying, I'm leaving my family too. How come she's getting all the radio and TV time? And also we were involved with things that had nothing to do with the fact that we were women. For instance, Darlene mentioned the fact that talking to the plane flying above, I was up in London coordinating telecommunications. That's where the Cincus Navier war room happened to be. We did all the communications stuff from there. And one of the things we learned early on is we had a much easier time fully communicating with ships from Australia, Canada, Great Britain, and other countries that were our allies in that war, but we couldn't talk to our own Air Force very well. It's a problem that has been worked on a lot since then and has been solved, but there were some funny things that you would notice during that Gulf War. At any rate, I would like to start off asking the panelists if they were aware much of the publicity about women, that constant nightly news. And I saw it because in the war room, we always had to have CNN on. So we saw the US version of CNN, even though we were in London. And all the time, there'd be coming on these stories about mothers deploying or women over there doing this or that. And the guys would turn around and tease us about how come it's always you on the television. But I was wondering if any of you were aware of some of the publicity at the time, were aware that this was the first major deployment of non-Nurse Corps women to a war zone, and your experience of that. Does anybody want to bite on that?
I could.
Okay.
During the Gulf War, when I was home, at times I would sit there and record. You know, I would, for my girls and that, I had stacks of VCR tapes where I recorded the wars. I recorded, you know, when my husband came on across the TV station, I recorded that. But during that whole time, I didn't really see that much focus on women in the war during the Gulf War. So,
Okay.
Well, I noticed that before I deployed, that during the buildup, during Desert Shield, there was an awful lot of information about women deploying, and as you said, the you know, the moms with babes in their arms crying, and the husbands, you know, saying goodbye. So I do believe that, yes, I was aware of that.
Well, deploying out of Germany, we had no idea. We were aware, of course, that women hadn't been deployed in such big numbers to a wartime situation, but in Germany, there really wasn't the attention. And in fact, when we returned back, there was actually anti-American sentiments in Germany, so we didn't have any concept about how important that was in the U.S. at all, as far as press was concerned.
Thanks. Another big shock, and this was sort of in the aftermath of the war. Well, there were several things that happened in the aftermath of the war. The first was it became apparent that just because the aircraft you were on or the ship you were on was not a combatant, or the fact that you were behind the front lines did not mean you were free of danger. And within the first 2 or 3 years after the Gulf War ended, Congress changed the law governing what women in the military could do. First, in the 1991 Authorization Act, they lifted the prohibition against women serving aboard combat aircraft, which was always kind of a strange demarcation anyway. For instance, the AWACS planes that did all the electronic targeting and the direction of the planes in the air were not considered combatants at the time. Although if you splashed one of those, the other ones didn't have somebody directing them. But the fighter planes, the attack planes, some of the helicopters, most of the patrol planes were off limits to women. So those were all opened by Congress in 1991. And as a result of the 1994 authorizations bill, all the combatant ships in the Navy were opened, except for certain things like submarines or some of the very small ships where privacy was an issue, where you couldn't really have a mixed crew aboard sleeping. And most of the Navy ships now are open to women, but a few aren't. The attack submarines and a couple of the very small riverine boats. But gradually, over the past 20 years, we've opened just about all the Navy combatants to women. Also, the Army and the Marine Corps did a big review of what they call their combat support jobs. Those are things like signals and intelligence, which aren't combatants per se, but they support the combatant troops, the infantry, the armor. Those were open to women in 1994. At the same time as the Navy ships were. The services had done a major review and opened many, many thousands of billets within combat support, which got women much, much closer to the front lines. And those same rules that apply to combat support are still the rules governing women's service in Iraq and Afghanistan, the stuff that came out of the Gulf War. They're inadequate for the job, but we still haven't figured out quite how to rectify that. It's a long-standing problem. That was on the active side. The other government agency that had a big shock in the aftermath of the Gulf War was the Department of Veterans Affairs. There were certainly women who were eligible to be treated medically or otherwise at VA, you know, to get the GI Bill and that kind of thing. But most of the ones, particularly those involved in VA healthcare, were from World War II or the Korean War, a few from Vietnam. So VA was used to a very small population of women, most of them well past their childbearing years, and many of whom, despite the fact that they were eligible for VA care, simply chose not to do it. So VA healthcare at that time was very male-oriented, and from the time that the Persian Gulf War ended until continuing right now today, there has been a major evolutionary change We're still not there yet, but VA has become more and more women-friendly. And I know you work at VA, and you may or may not get VA care, but I was wondering if anybody on the panel would like to discuss their experiences with VA and how, particularly over the years as VA was trying to get used to women as their healthcare patients.
Yeah, I got a comment. When I retired from the military in 2000, it took me over 10 years to apply for my VA benefits and services. And due to when I applied, of course, you know, it took me almost 2 years. And here, I was service connected, and you know, with the VA, I gave them a copy of my records. I even had tabbed out all my service connected issues, and I presented it, and they said I was zero across the board. And I work at VA, and I said, oh no. I said, you will make me an appointment, and I want to see a couple doctors. It's in there, and my first medical appointment was here at the VA Medical Center here in Washington, D.C., and when I went in there, he goes, what are you doing here? He goes, is your service connected? I go, then why would they send me? You know, and so all of a sudden I went from 0% to 100% service connected disabled. And that kind of really, and then I can really understand how these veterans, they would apply, and if they're told, no, you're not, no, you're zero across the board, and when in fact it's not true, and they give up. And this is why we have, especially for, you know, like women, they don't self-identify as veterans, and so now we're trying to push, yes, you're a veteran, and especially like for American Indians, a lot of them don't see females as vets. If you haven't served in an actual war, you're not considered a veteran, and that is so wrong. And so now we're trying to push that, and also with vets and that, if you try to apply for your benefits, and don't give up the first time around, make us do our job to take care of you, keep going, keep pushing, because, you know, they did that to me, and I said, and I knew it wasn't true, and I kept fighting for it, pushing and pushing, and there's one issue that nobody VA would even like, vouch for me because it didn't happen while I was in the military, and I actually had to get a medical doctor that did surgery, and I said, I just need you to prove, just say, due to my surgery, the size, everything, that I did not have this while I was in the military. And the doctor came back and he said that you had this problem 2 years prior to getting out of the military. But it took a while to do that, and I just kept pushing, and yeah, it took me over 10 years to even apply, but then another couple of years to actually get the services that was due. Thank you.
So with regards to women's only clinics, when I first accessed the VA hospital in Seattle, there was a small women's clinic, but they had no separate women's access. So for example, if a woman had military sexual trauma, she was forced to walk through all of the men and go to the clinic appointments, and the level of privacy was really, actually really low. So it's evolved now into VA hospitals having their own separate entrance, really actually nice women's clinics where women have their own primary care providers within the clinics, and in fact, women can receive prenatal care at these clinics a lot of times now. So there has been a huge evolution since we were deployed.
Anything else any of you would like to mention before I open the floor for questions? Yes?
I do have something that was a little bit different. I was also a dual military, in a dual military marriage, and my ex-husband was a SEAL officer, and of course he had deployed many times prior to this. I had deployed twice before, but this third deployment during the Gulf War was really different for him because he was home during the conflict. He wasn't deployed. And so as soon as I got underway for the Gulf, I didn't have time to call him, and of course we had no way of really contacting him before, and I'll never forget so and then he sees my picture all over the place, I told you that already. But he finally understood what it was like to have a spouse at home while the member was deployed to, you know, a conflict. And that just was a real eye-opener for him.
Okay, now I would like to take questions from the floor, and the gentleman in the back has a microphone. If you would like to ask a question, he'll bring the microphone over to you. Somebody must, or I'll have to ask you questions. Bob.
What I'd like to know is, looking back to when you served 20 years ago, what do you think about the women of today who are serving, and what thoughts come to mind when you see what they've gone through in the last 10 years?
I'm really, really proud of them. I mean, I think they have really, I mean, as Lori was saying, there's always this segment of the population that wants to poo-poo women's capabilities. And, it's like we have to keep proving ourselves over and over again. And even now, with all the evidence that shows that women are doing the jobs that need to be done in the war zone, they're fighting in the war zone, they're protecting themselves and their charges in the war zone, we still have this combat exclusion policy that doesn't make sense for today's military. So I'm very, very proud of them and all that they've accomplished in the last few years.
One of the things that I experienced when I came back was that, my experience, although I was there with a man next to me, my experience was devalued because I was a woman. So although I'd had the same experience, it wasn't as valuable in people's minds. And I think that that's really improved this time around. I think that women's contributions are acknowledged a lot more, and I'm proud of all the progress they've made too, but I'm really pleased to see the fact that their contribution is acknowledged more so than it was.
During my experience in the military when I was, I found that even though like in 1980 all the way up to almost 2000, I had to kind of act like a man, think like a man, and then be a female at the same time. So it's just like, I found myself where I had to put myself in a position where I can't be walked or pushed around. But with the women today, there's a reason why females join the military. It's to protect our country. And then when you have people out there that don't want women fighting along the other soldiers, it's ask us how we feel about it and if we want to fight with them, because we join the military just like the males for one reason, is to protect our country.
Question here. Yes. He's coming with him.
I'm curious to know, in terms of personnel, do you have any information on quotas, either for or against women?
Right now, today? I can address that unless somebody on the panel. It depends. Do you mean quotas saying you have to have X number of women, or quotas that are targets that are floor or ceiling quotas?
I mean both. They
Okay.
can't put in any more than this number.
Mm-hmm.
Also.
For the Air Force, about 99% of all jobs are open to women. So they, at least on paper, don't have any quotas. And about 19% of the Air Force is currently female. Navy is driven by how many berths aboard a ship can have female sailors. For officers, because of the way the officers are aboard ship, there's no limitation, or very few limitations, because of the way their sleeping quarters are. There's usually only 2 to 4 to a room. So the Navy has been stuck at about 14 to 15% women, and it's largely driven not so much because various occupations are closed to them, but because the way the ships are configured, only X% of a crew can be male or female. So the quotas work both ways, in a sense. Typically, a crew might be about 80% male and about 20% female, but it varies from ship to ship. Army and Marine Corps is a little bit different. Large numbers of the jobs, the billets, and both the units and the occupations in both those services are closed to women because they are infantry, armor, special forces, or short-range field artillery. And because so many jobs are closed to women, it drives the number of women below, say, what the Air Force could take. On the other hand, particularly the Army, since the Gulf War began, could recruit more women if more women, particularly on the enlisted side, wanted to enlist in the Army. So they have not run out of room for women, but fewer women have actually enlisted in the Army. Percentage-wise, the Army's about 13% of their enlisted personnel are now women. Officers is closer to 16%. So there are limitations on the number that can be allowed initial entry that's governed by what is or isn't open, but it's not a formal quota. Also, over the past couple of years, the service academies, West Point, Naval Academy, and Air Force Academy, they used to artificially, I think, this is me speaking, lower keep the lid on the number of women going through the academies. It was sort of, not officially, but it was sort of closed off at about 14%. But in the past 3 or 4 years, led by the Naval Academy, they've lifted those sort of informal quotas, and they tied them to, well, 14% of the forces enlisted, so 14% of the officers coming through here should be women, or 14% of the enlisted forces women. They stopped doing that, and gradually the percentages of women at the service academies is raising pretty much all above 20% now. So it's a complex answer. I'm not aware of any formal quotas unless it's some very specific occupation where most of the jobs are in units that don't allow women. One that comes to mind is some of the chemical warfare officer stuff in the Army. So there are some women in chemical warfare, but there can't be that many because most of the jobs are in units that don't allow women. So it's more along those lines. Microphone guy? Oh, he's got it. Great.
Do you think the current limitations on what women are allowed to do in any branch of the service are reasonable?
Anybody want to take that?
Of course, I don't think they're reasonable. You know, I've always been an advocate for women being able to do the things that they are capable of doing and qualified to do, and it shouldn't be based on gender. There should be job-related requirements. Many of the requirements in the past have just been requirements to keep people out rather than requirements that actually represented what the job entailed. So obviously not all women could be an infantryman and carry a 100-pound pack for miles and miles that they have to do. But I believe that there are women who can, and it shouldn't be based just on that one aspect of gender. It should be based on whether or not they're capable of doing the job.
Anybody else? Because I would tend to agree with Darlene 100%. And I would also say a lot of people don't realize how much during this war women have been doing things that are technically off limits to them. For those of you who don't know, what's currently closed to women are units and occupations whose primary mission is ground warfare. So the infantry and the units of occupation of the units that are infantry units, armor, et cetera. Also special forces closed to women in all services. But during this war, particularly in Afghanistan, women have been traveling with our special forces out in the field on their own because they have to be there. Special forces has lots of missions. One of them is gathering local intelligence. And when more than half the population is female and they're not allowed to talk to our men, we can't gather intelligence as effectively without those women traveling with special forces. Women have also gone with infantry units, the Lionesses, and more recently the Marine Corps' female engagement teams. They travel with small squadrons, platoons, companies of infantry, particularly when they're doing things like house raids, where there are likely to be women and children present. Among other things, the women can search the local women, but also it tends to keep the lid on violence when women are there. So women have been doing for 10 years now all kinds of things that are still technically off limits to them. There was a big change that came about in February that did away with what used to be called the co-location rule. That said that if you're, say, a medic, you could be a medic, but you couldn't be a medic if you were a woman with a small infantry squad. You couldn't, even though we were attaching women medics as opposed to assigning them. That's a real technical distinction the forces make. 2 small infantry squadrons, if she was the only medic available, out she went. So that kind of prohibition is gone. But the basic ones, nothing has changed, although the services will owe another report to Congress on the potential to open more, probably in mid-November.
We'll take one more question back here.
Thank you. This question's for Julie or anybody else on the panel in particular. Regarding Gulf War illness post-war, in particular with women, you kind of touched on it earlier. Can you talk about the process, how it was for you, and how you think that relates to how women are treated today after Iraq and Afghanistan?
A lot of people started getting sick actually when we were still in Saudi Arabia. There was an onset of rashes and headaches. I think that's where things primarily began. And then as everybody returned home, there were strange reports of continued rashes and nausea and headaches and symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome and digestive issues, and it continued on. And even 10 years after the war, there weren't a lot of concrete diagnoses. They knew that there were three different groups of clusters of illnesses, ill-defined illnesses that they now refer to as Gulf War illness, but specific diagnoses of diseases hadn't taken place yet, and it's only in the last 10 years that that's happened. So we still have a lot of progress to make. Does that answer your question? Mm-hmm.
Anybody else want to make a contribution to that? Yeah.
I'm just curious, I got in a little late, but I wonder, does anybody know any statistics about how many women were actually surveyed in the Gulf?
I have that in front of me, actually.
And I wondered also, how that compares to the Afghanistan conflict or Iraq.
I don't have any of today's statistics.
I have those statistics,
Okay.
so you go first.
Okay. There were 54,000 women deployed for the Persian Gulf War that were actually involved in the Gulf War. And of that number, there were 13,000 women who were exposed to the chemicals of chemosia. That's the breakdown that I have.
There were also 15 women killed during the Persian Gulf War, and 2 of them who were prisoners of war. The current war, and again, keep in mind, the current wars have been gone on for more than 10 years now, as opposed to nowhere near that length for the Persian Gulf War. The both parts of it, both the deployment and the war itself, were over in less than in about a year. So, so far, over 250,000 women have deployed in support of the current war, which is about 10% of the deployed force. It was about 7% of the deployed force during the Persian Gulf War. Over 140 women have been killed. 865 have received Purple Hearts during the current wars. And a number of them have received other major military awards for valor. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's been great having you here today. I want to thank you, and I'm sure everyone in the audience wants to thank you, not as your service as women, but as your service in the armed forces and your service to your country. As Juanita said, all of us who serve are Americans who are there to defend our country. I would also like, there's some other women veterans in the audience. Would you please stand up? I know you're here. Let's all give a round of applause to all our veterans. Again, thank you for being here today. If you want some more information about the Veterans History Project, we have it outside. My staff is here as well to talk to you about how you can tell the story of the woman or man in your life who is a veteran. Again, thanks for being here and hope to see you next time.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.